So in this video, I want to explain what logotherapy is. I'll give a gross overview of its major premises, and it will be split into two parts because the second part will be elaborating on one of them in slightly more detail. So first, I'll give definitions. I'll have to explain what existential analysis is, as logotherapy and existential analysis are, well, they're closely intertwined. So existential analysis, broadly, is the analysis of existence as it relates to the human mind. Logotherapy, broadly, is derived from the Greek word logos, which can be translated as meaning, and therapy, which is, well, it's really any treatment intended to relieve or heal a disorder. So literally, therapy through meaning. Now, existential analysis is the philosophical and scientific basis of logotherapy, where logotherapy is the clinical application of these principles using particular therapeutic techniques. So to draw an example, just as medicine is the ethical and scientific practice that forms the basis of a doctor's decision, existential analysis is exactly that to the logotherapist. Now, they overlap considerably, so for simplicity, I will just refer to logotherapy and existential analysis as logotherapy from here on, and that is primarily to save myself. So, logotherapy is a therapeutic approach developed by a neurologist and psychiatrist from Vienna named Viktor Frankl. The beginning of its development dates back to the 1930s, and it's based on the premise that the primary motivational force of an individual is the search for meaning. Now, this is opposed to Nietzsche's will to power, or even Freud's will to pleasure. People want to be happy, but we don't need to be happy. What we need is a reason to be happy, and that is our meaning. So, a point of clarification here before I move on. I want to emphasize the importance of merging philosophy with scientific discovery. Now, philosophy has become increasingly detached from the process of living the good life. It had its origins in establishing ways in which to live life in a way that was both virtuous and also conducive with a sense of well-being. Literally translated, it could be split into philo, which is just love, and Sophie, wisdom, so just literally loving wisdom. So unfortunately now I feel like it's become more of a language game, and it spends more time on focusing on the kind of parsing of concepts, which is important, but I feel like in doing so, it's lost its purchase of something really important. It used to place most of its emphasis on how to live. And so what existential analysis does, or logotherapy, is it brings these practical philosophical concepts back to the fore, and in doing so, merging the timeless truths with scientific study of mind and behavior. And to emphasize, both are needed, but it is a fine balance. If the philosophy of kind of any therapeutic process is overemphasized, the process can become vague and, well, without direction. Whereas, say for instance, with what is now happening in medicine and psychotherapy, when science is overemphasized at the exclusion of philosophy, the process becomes kind of robotic and formulaic. There is no best move in chess, and so walking the fine line between both fields really isn't negotiable. The major premises of logotherapy I'll go on to explaining now. I personally find it helpful to categorize the information into three triads. The first triad is that logotherapy is based on three concepts. So it's the freedom of will, the will to meaning, and the meaning of life. The second triad is that the meaning of life is composed of three main groups of values, and that's creative, experiential, and attitudinal values. Now, the third is that attitudinal values can be further split up into somebody's attitude to pain, guilt, and death. So the freedom of will. Now, this is seen as the human capacity to take a stand towards whatever conditions may confront him. It really pertains to the unique ability to detach ourselves from both internal and external conditions. And now it's our ability to detach, to place ourselves in a dimension in which we can, well, observe the state of our mind, but also our body and environment as almost bystanders. It's this dimension which is denoted to in logotherapy as the noetic dimension. To draw a parallel, Christianity may refer to this as the soul, Hinduism, Atman, or contemplative practices in the East, the spirit. So a different term is used here predominantly in the attempt to neither assume or deny a theological cause for this ability, for example, a higher power. It's recognized instead as kind of being a result of anthropological processes, the process in which the expansion of the frontal regions of our neocortex and the increasing density of neural connections which resulted in an increasing intelligence, and it made us capable of abstract thought, which is just really considering concepts beyond what we observe physically. Complex motor skills, which are useful but also necessary for speech, amongst other things, but it was this which made us capable of really complicated things. It's also what contributes to our reliance on bonds with others and our desire to leave an impact. But it is this ability to detach from our own self-preoccupation and our need to reach out beyond that of merely our own self-concern. In logotherapy is what we refer to as the noetic dimension. Now, whether you think it's kind of only a matter of time until we can explain consciousness as a result of biological processes, and by being biological, susceptible to conditioning, or that it was caused by the design of a higher being, is not really of my concern. What is that our inability to explain something should not result in us neglecting it. Now, there's an interesting debate here on free will, which I'll probably leave for another day. But the fact of the matter is, what constitutes our attitude, or even the conditions which result in the will we wish to emphasize, remains to be objectively quantified. But nevertheless, it can still be appealed to. And for any change to occur, the individual's will should always be emphasized. The dimensions that constitute the human being in logotherapy are the body, the mind, and the noetic. Now, this is known as the law of dimensional ontology. Now, there's no need to expand on this other than to say that I'll pop the first law on the screen. In this diagram, the human being in its entirety can be seen here depicting the cylinder in the three-dimensional plane. Now, the two-dimensional projections of this cylinder depict the human being as interpreted by two differing specialities. The inconsistencies of a cylinder's projections in this particular diagram really serve as an important metaphor for the danger in the pretense that a representative model of the constituents of human being can be mapped from the perspective of one projection. And this leads to a point that is emphasized in logotherapy, which is that danger does not lie in the lack of universality, but instead the pretense of totality. So in other words, danger does not lie in scientists specializing, but in the fact that specialists are generalizing. And in my experience in the medical field, I see people, including myself, find comfort in certainty, but so much so that it's almost impossible for them to remain within the confines of their speciality, and instead draw conclusions of topics that they are completely ignorant of. And this should be avoided at all costs, and it extends to the assessment of what may constitute a human being. So in the diagram above, there is no claim as to what constitutes a human being. The claim is in fact that it's dangerous to predict. The emphasis is on the fact that there remains to be an explanation of much of what humans subjectively experience. And modelling the constituents of the human being in which the constituents cannot yet be objectively quantified on incomplete information is just destined to be inaccurate. The will to meaning in logotherapy is seen as the primary motivational force of human beings, viewing the will to power and the will to pleasure as subordinates. Now, pleasure and power are not the end goal, or even destinations in which the possession of them will leave us fulfilled. Instead, they are the tools that drive us. Pleasure drives us in a way that provides us with a reason, to orientate towards the good and away from the bad. And power drives us in a way that, it's often a necessary prerequisite to attaining a goal, but they're not final destinations. And another way to look at it is that when we are aiming purely for power or pleasure, we are aiming at a fulfillment of the self, as opposed to the fulfillment of something greater. Now, the fulfillment of self is otherwise commonly referred to as self-actualization. And it's true that actualizing potential is an important psychological need, but it isn't the final destination. And whether seen as a curse or a blessing, and I haven't quite made my mind up yet on this, there's no avoiding the fact that the only way of fulfilling our own needs is to involve ourselves with something greater. And so our ultimate goal is to transcend ourselves. I mean, it's not only this, but self-actualization can actually only occur when we are contributing to a cause that is greater than our own self-perception. So on the screen now, it's an updated hierarchy of needs. This hierarchy was constructed by a man named Abraham Maslow. It was originally famed for self-actualization being at the top, but he actually went on to criticize his own original work on self-actualization, adding transcendence above all else. Now, when we become intent on fulfilling our own needs, as opposed to fulfilling a meaning, it does more than just make this very intention less likely to happen. That this kind of self-preoccupation can also be the cause, well, it can both cause and maintain much of our mental suffering. The belief that we should be directing our energy towards attaining a tensionless state, this belief is a dangerous one. Suffering too few demands can be just as problematic, I would say more, as suffering with too many. Like, we often see that those who are spared tension, well, they often create it. And tension created without a goal, on the background of a self-preoccupation, often leads to a pathological kind, a kind of inward tension that breeds neurotic tendencies, such as the losing battle for perfection, ruminating on past events, or a brilliant one for me is kind of creating 1,000 variations of future scenarios. What we all need to prevent this tension is that kind of tension that's directed outwards, one that's nourished by a meaning to fulfill. This tension is that between the object, which is kind of you as you stand in the present, and the subject, which is kind of what you're attaining to try to be, between the I am and the I ought. Almost between the reality and the ideal. And in logotherapy, we see this as being between being and meaning. And if this tension is to be preserved, meaning has to be prevented from coinciding with being. This necessary tension can often vanish in the individual that is intent solely on self-actualization. Because in peak experiences, the I am and the I ought have merged together. And it's in those very experiences that purpose is lost. And we see this quite often with, say, athletes that spiral into a depression after achieving whatever they set out to achieve. And so this is why it's necessary for us to all live in terms of self-transcendence, to live in terms of a reason which extends beyond that of our own self-preoccupation. So the meaning of life is based on the premise that life has meaning under any circumstance, and meaning is unconditional. Now, I'll elaborate further on this in part 2 of this video, where I'll touch upon the second and the third triad. That is the way in which meaning can be encountered, and also elaborate upon the attitudinal values. That wraps it up for this video. I hope this video has been of interest to you, and thank you very much for watching.